I don't know if Anne-Marie is still here. Yes, Anne-Marie is still here. I liked your slide with the tree and the roots. Partly because the name Goyder is Welsh for forester, so I am by birth a tree man. But partly because I often say about success in business that, it's no good just looking at the tree. We actually need to understand the soil in which a tree is growing. And in Tomorrow's Company, we try and think about inspiring companies to be a force for good. That's our purpose. But we try and think about the surrounding conditions, the underlying conditions for the success of a company. And as you'll see, we try to think a lot about, in a way that's consistent with one of Will's early slides, about the way in which a company is part of an economic system, which in turn is very much a subsidiary part of a social system, which in turn is very much a subsidiary part of an ecosystem. And only if we think of things in that way, with humility, will we who work in business in different ways understand our contribution. But I shall also go on to say that actually the evidence suggests that if we do those things, we will also be more profitable. So just briefly to introduce Tomorrow's Company and what we do, as John said, Tomorrow's Company was founded 20 years ago, the result of a piece of work which was looking at the role of business in a changing world. We've now been around for 20 years, and the world we described as changing 20 years ago, of course, has moved on so dramatically that we're now engaged in something we're calling our Futures Project, where we are seeking to redefine the changing world which will we need to understand for the success of business. But from the experience of what we've done, working with business leaders in terms of how does a board do its job well, how do you communicate well, what you're trying to do, how do you govern a business well, what can we learn from the past disasters. I wrote a paper about 12 years ago called Lessons from Enron, and I could have almost changed the title, anybody like to volunteer a few other examples like Enron from which we might learn lessons from HSBC. I mean, any contributions? Lessons from Tesco, mid-staffs perhaps. I mean, it's business in the wider sense, governance in the wider sense. There are huge lessons there as well. So in Tomorrow's Company, we both try to inspire, but we also try to enable companies to and their leaders to be a force for good. And we work very strongly with the investment community as well. And so it seemed to me that what I was being asked to do in a provocation was to say something about what I see changing in the world of the private sector. Something in examples that may be relevant, but more than that, something about the assumptions that we've learned in the business context over 20 years that we need to challenge, so that we can then think about some of the assumptions that in the wider health context we might want to challenge as well. I was talking about the disasters, and there is a litany of disasters in corporate terms, corporate car crashes from which we can learn. And Will was talking about the way in which the acceleration since about the time when some of us were born in the early part of the 1950s, the acceleration of everything. That is one reason why today's peacock is tomorrow's feather duster. But the other thing is we tend to focus on the corporate disasters, and so I find it quite distressing that if you looked at the slide that Will Day showed of the public levels of trust, that trust in business is so low, when actually if you deconstruct and if you actually deal with that at the level of companies that we've individually dealt with, you find in the research that actually there are higher levels of trust, and there are positive stories to tell about what's been changing in the last 20 years. And one of the things we're doing in the Futures Project is not only to do the timeline of the disasters, but the companies which have, over that time, done the things that we've talked about in terms of seeing business as a human activity, seeing relationships and purpose at the heart of a successful business. We've just heard from Arab. Arab is a very fine example, and one certainly Tomorrow's Company has been pleased to be involved with, of a company which sees the human purposes of business and seeks to achieve an economic result while achieving a human result as well. And I was talking earlier to Will, he was talking about a South African bank called Nedbank, which has decided to over time, to switch the whole of its pure portfolio into the things which it believes will be valuable in the future, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about agriculture and so on. It was pointed out to me, everybody's always talking about Tesco at the moment. People talk less about Next, a company which has had the same chief executive for many years. When it hit a bad year, that chief executive said, I don't want the bonus that I've been given and the shares that I've been given. I want to share them with all the team because I think they've had a pretty hard year as well. I was talking yesterday to a company some of you may know in the health world, Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk, for the whole of the time that I've been dealing with this world, have been talking about a purpose beyond profit, which is actually to cure diabetes. That's the corporate purpose of Novo Nordisk. And very significantly, they have an ownership structure owned partly by foundation, which protects them so they can continue to pursue that purpose. So I want to talk a little bit more about how, a few years ago, we were mad enough and bold enough to approach a number of chief executives of global companies and a number of civil society organizations as well, and say, okay, what's the role of the global company in the future? And this is the statement of purpose that that group, companies from India, from the United States, from continental Europe, this is the statement of purpose that they came up with, to provide ever better goods and services in a way that is profitable, ethical, and respects the environment, individuals, and the communities in which it operates. And then they said, to fulfill this purpose, we're going to have to understand the changing world. We're going to have to understand what, in shorthand, we call the triple context. And we're going to have to do what they called, this was a guy called Nandan Nilekani, who was then chairman of an Indian company called Infosys, who coined this phrase with us, and who went on to be an Indian cabinet minister. He coined the phrase, expanding the space. And whereas in 1994, in our original work, we talked about the idea of the license to operate, which at the time nobody was talking about, and which since has become very popular, he talked about expanding the space. And in that a graphic which you may not be able to see, there are three elements to expanding the space. The first one is that a company will put at the heart of its purpose and strategy the needs of society. The second one is companies have always been about values, and the evidence is very clear that companies which have a clear and strong sense of values and are connected with the society around them have in the long term outperformed others. I'll come back to that in a moment. But embedding values in a global company is a particular challenge, because how do you find the common ground in your diversity policies between the issues you face in Chile, the issues you face in Hong Kong, and the issues you face in Riyadh, for example? And yet the global companies we were talking to, global companies like ABB is one example, Unilever, have worked those issues through. And they have said there's a core at the deep human level of things we have in common. And yes, when we're operating in very different cultures, we then have to apply those core values in different ways. So that was the second big challenge for global companies. And the third big challenge, which I think is highly relevant to our discussions this morning, to our conversations, I should say, the third big element was the element of creating frameworks. And to illustrate what I mean by creating frameworks, you can think about many areas where people complain at the moment that there's no global government, so we can't control the global company. I mean, the classic one is tax. And what I've been saying in the companies that I've been asked to give advice to as a critical friend is, you can't just sit there and say, but we're complying with the law. You know, if you want to impose a different law, we'll do something different. It's simply, that's what slave traders could have argued 200 or so years ago. It simply doesn't stand up. There's this license to operate, it's a moving line. People's public perception changes. What good companies do, what tomorrow's companies do, is they work with civil society to create the frameworks within which good behavior is defined. And what they then do is they say, we're signing up to this standard of good behavior, we're going to shame those who are not willing to sign up, we're going to let transparency take its course. And what you notice over time, and I'm thinking about things like the Marine Stewardship Council, the Forestry Stewardship Council, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, all of them, over time, things on human rights from the UN, over time, this becomes a form of global soft law. And it starts to appear in the courts, and the courts start to say, well, yes, okay, but there is a stated good practice. Were you complying with it in trying to reach a judgment on guilt or innocence? So the idea, and let me give you a very, very vivid example. A writer called Stuart Hart, who did a lot of work on the whole bottom of the pyramid idea, gave an example from Kenya. The pyrethrum growers in Kenya were producing a product which at the time was being used by a North American company called SC Johnson for household cleaners. The Japanese invented a synthetic substitute, and suddenly the pyrethrum growers were going to be out of business. Many people in relatively poor rural surroundings were going to be out of business. What happened? If the market had taken its course, that would have been that. What actually happened was a combination of SC Johnson, which was incidentally a family-owned business, saying, let's try and work at this. How can we find a way around this? Of the Reserve Board, of Pyrethrum Reserve Board of Kenya saying, well, we're here to provide a kind of underpinning guarantee of quality. And an NGO, which had been working for some years, increasing the capability of the pyrethrum growers, saying, well, we will work with the pyrethrum growers. Let's, SC Johnson, you set us the target, quality and price, that makes us competitive with the Japanese product. Let's work together. And because they had the guarantee from the government body, the Reserve Board, because they had the NGO working on the capability on the ground, and because they had a global company which had the vision to say, we can make this work, the pyrethrum growers kept their business. And I think that's a lovely example of the kind of frameworks we might think about if we want to be encouraged in the way we look at healthy cities. So, last year I republished a book I'd written years ago. I was persuaded to by some people in Tata in India, which would be one of the companies on my list of companies I greatly admire. Tata has had a purpose beyond profit. Tata was founded by Parsis who believed that unless India grew its own indigenous business and solved its own problems, then it would never progress and develop. And of course the British laughed, and then when Tata said we're going to make our own steel, and you know who ended up buying British steel? Tata Steel. But at the heart of my argument, and this is the result of, I guess, more than 1,000 conversations over 20 years, I've come to the view that there are 5 things that drive the false understanding by business people and people outside business about what business is about, and they are these. First of all, do we really believe that people are simply motivated by money? Well, my answer is no. Do we think markets are supposed to be masters, or do we think they're supposed to be servants? Well, I'd say servants. Do we think that business is a part of, or do we think it's apart from society? Well, I would say it's a part of. Ultimately, it's a servant of. I'm going to come to the word stewardship in a minute. It's a steward for many assets that it inherits. What do we think of as value? Do we think of value as something where if a business gets engaged in its community, it costs it and it makes less money? Or do we actually think of value as a positive sum game, where actually the more you invest in all your relationships, the more you get back. I believe in that abundance way of thinking. Do we believe that we can slice people up? So we can say, no, I can't do that for my people or the community, because if I were to do that, I'd be taking something away from my shareholders. Well, hang on a minute. Who are my shareholders? Deconstruct the value chain from the pension fund to the individual beneficiary, and what do you get? You get the people in the room who are also employees, who are also customers, who are also neighbours. They're also, certainly in a global sense, they're part of the community. So where is this irrational, sliced up, compartmentalized idea that we think of people only wearing one hat? As is often said, you know, I remember the great Sir Adrian Cadbury saying it to me, you know, yes, I want to retire with a good pension, but I want to retire into a world where the air I breathe is good, and the children I see going to school are well educated and so on. Now, the attitudes we have to business is based on, in my view, perverse answers to those 5 questions. And let me tell you, when I launched this book, I was invited to speak to an audience of chief investment officers at the Bombay Stock Exchange. And when I did the 5 questions with them, they came up with the same answers that I would have come up with. And I said to them, well, your industry doesn't work by these principles that you've just committed to. And they said, no. And I said to them, well, we've got a problem then, haven't we? And they said, yes. And that's the nexus of the problem that we in Tomorrow's Company are trying to work on. And I'm going to talk about it in a minute in the context of stewardship. So, if, by analogy, if I then take the questions we've been asking about business for 20 years and I think about what does it mean for how we see health, and probably most of this is just your everyday kind of what you've thought about before breakfast, but forgive me if it's a bit retro for you. So, do we think of people as whole or in part? Years ago, I was persuaded to read a book called Anti-Cancer by a very interesting doctor called David Shriver. Fascinating book. He himself, in his early life, had a very specialized technological attitude to medicine, and then he got cancer. And he talked about his experience and his journey, and he talked about the power in his recovery of being dealt with or dealing with himself, insisting he was dealt with as a whole person. The power of meditation, the power of taking control of your own self and health. Dependence or self-management? Well, that's what I've just talked about. Do we think of health provision in any kind of compartmentalized slice, the way that too many business people think about their role? Or do we think about it in a holistic way, which I guess is what these 1,000 conversations are about? Can we think of examples like the frameworks example I gave with the pyrethrum growers? What would be your equivalent in your work with your neighbours and your stakeholders and suppliers, etc., of that pyrethrum example? And then we come to this great big elephant in the room of health, which is public versus private. Don't trust the private sector. Let the private sector into the health service. It's greed. It's going to corrupt it. Well, of course, we know. We see those motivations. But if we're talking about the kind of numbers in terms of how much savings the nation is going to demand of the health service if meeting the growing demand, how can we not take advantage of every single piece of creativity or innovation around the place? And we've did a piece of work which Arup were involved in called Tomorrow's Business Forms, in which we talked about the way in which companies need to rethink their forms. And we talked about wonderful hybrids emerging. So, for example, Serco, a company much abused, but Serco, a company with some very good core values in its history, and a company which I believe is seeking to get back to that. When they wanted business with Glasgow doing housing, they recognised that they weren't going to win the trust of their users with their conventional business model. And they invented a hybrid, which was actually a limited liability partnership, which they worked in partnership with the local authority and a social enterprise, and it's a successful hybrid. Now, in terms of letting the private sector into the public sector while earning the public's trust, that they're not all like Southern Cross or G4S or whichever examples you choose, we've suggested that we need something called a trust test. The idea that a buyer of health services would have a kind of character test, that a business would have to go through before it could even get on the procurement shortlist. And if you're interested, I'll send you the current draft of it, which we've been trying to interest people as varied as the Cabinet Office and the Care Quality Commission in at the moment. But it's just an example of innovation, of trying to draw the best value wherever we find it. And of course, as has been said earlier today, and I think will be coming up later today, let's think about value. Let's not think about its profit versus care. What's value? Let's have an integrated view of value. Let's agree on that. Let's make sure that procurement doesn't drive that coach and horses between finance on that side and human care on the other. And so I said I'd come back to the question of research. What does research tell us? There is so much evidence, and I talk about it in the book, there is so much evidence. Did you know in Japan, there are 3 companies that have lasted more than 1,000 years. In Japan, there are hundreds of companies which have lasted more than 200 years. What do they have in common? Well, Professor Funabashi, who did this study, says what they have in common is a very clear sense of purpose and what they stand for, and a strong connectedness with the society around them. 2 guys from Stanford did a study, Built to Last. Companies that outperformed the stock market 15 times over 50 years, what did they have in common? They called it a core ideology, a common sense of what they stood for, and again, a very clear sense of connectedness. I could go on. The point is, the idea that you have to choose between having a culture that is committed to relationships, to responsibility, to sustainability, against profit. It's an illusory idea. It's an idea that's sustained by the kind of fund manager who's bonused on a quarterly basis, the kind of fund manager that you and I, in the future, need to hold better to account. And here I come back to one of the questions that our last speaker from Arab asked, which was, how can we use technology differently in the future? Well, how we can use technology differently in the future, I would suggest, one way, is that we actually need to be able to say, I want to be a good steward of my investments. I want to be reassured that the portfolio of my investments that I can track on my iPhone or whatever actually is being well stewarded for a long-term time horizon by the people that I'm dealing with. And we've done a lot of work, and we plan to do more work about this idea of investor stewardship and how we can re-empower the ultimate saver who is the owner of the global company. Because of time, I'm just going to finally talk about the 4 principles of stewardship. I think it may be helpful to talk about the needs of healthy cities in this dialogue in terms of stewardship. Stewardship to us means I've inherited something. We've inherited something. Look around us. We've inherited some wonderful assets. We're here for a while as stewards of those assets. How are we stewarding those assets? And there are 4 principles. The first is, if we are a steward of anything, and that applies to a board, it applies to an investment institution, it applies to a police authority, are we clear about our mandate? Are we clear about our purpose? Are we clear about our values? So principle 1, clarity. Second principle, what are we doing continuously to improve performance? Without that, we're uncompetitive, we're failing our clients, and so on. Third principle, and we're back here to trees, planting for the future. How are we balancing the short term and the long term? Because if we don't get the short term right, certainly in the commercial sector, we're out of business. But if we don't get the long term right, well, I think Will Day has painted the picture. And finally, the 4th principle is this principle about being part of the landscape. Are we looking outwards? Are we sensing and shaping the landscape? Classic example of a business sector that failed to do that, US car industry. What did they do? They were so busy paying PR companies to lobby against higher environmental standards that they ruled themselves out of the Chinese auto market, the largest market in the world. So, that to me is some of leads to these questions really, which is where I conclude. How do we engage with companies whose purpose goes beyond profit? Let's not assume that those companies we're dealing with are only interested in profit. I often say, on the basis of my experience over 20 years, that inside every company CEO there's a human being trying to climb out. How do we transcend this public sector good, private sector bad thing and get out of that into the innovation space where we're judging people on their merits? What are the opportunities around the exciting new hybrids we see? Everything from mutuals to social enterprise to listed companies that are changing their ownership structure so they're more like John Lewis. There's a ferment of change going on. How can we ally with people whose corporate form seems closer to what we're trying to do? How can we change the role of pension funds and institutions so they start to be better stewards of our assets? And finally, is the language of stewardship itself with those 4 principles perhaps a helpful frame for all of these 1,000 conversations? Thank you very much.